Hello everybody, thank you very much for coming and joining us for the guest lecture of Gregg Lambert. It's my great pleasure to welcome here Gregg, who has been here already 5 times, or it's his 5th time you have been in Prague, and I don't think it's necessary to introduce Gregg. You can find all the information on Wikipedia. Just let me mention that he's author of 18 books and critical editions, author of more than 100 articles, and professor at Syracuse University. There is, however, one thing I would like to emphasize at the beginning. Gregg is also founder of the Perpetual Peace Project. As the title suggests, it is the project that is focused on Kant's idea of perpetual peace, and the whole project is obviously inspired by the war in Ukraine and the necessity to think about war and peace in those odd times we are living in. So this lecture is also meant as a contribution to our continuous effort to think about peace and war together, and Gregg will tell you more about the whole project, about the conferences we are planning, and about the cooperation between the Syracuse University and Institute of Philosophy in Prague. Thank you very much, Gregg,
Thank you,
for
Peter.
being with us.
It's always a pleasure. And as Peter said, this I think the 5th time that I've given a lecture in this room, so I'm very familiar with the room, and it's always been a pleasure, and it's been a very welcoming crowd that every time I've come, and I hope that that continues to be the case today. As I described in the abstract that you've seen that I gave to Peter, this talk is part of a longer theoretical study associated with the practical initiatives of what is the 3rd phase of the Perpetual Peace Project, which actually started in 2008 and has had 3 separate or even 4 separate initiatives, beginning with an initiative with the United Nations, the 2nd initiative in Utrecht, which was a series of interventions in artistic, even a film that was produced around the question of immigration in Europe at that time. So that took place in 2011, 2012 during a lot of the immigration crisis and the drowning of the refugees in the Mediterranean. We had several high-level NGOs involved in that. So it's always been a project that has tried to combine both academic and non-academic NGO and different kinds of specializations and disciplines. And this 3rd phase now is explicitly in response to the war in Ukraine. And we're just at the beginning of planning several initiatives, one of which is going to be a conference next fall at Ústí nad Labem, which is being organized by my dear colleague Michaela Fezerova, who I just went up and visited the campus yesterday, and I think it'll be an ideal venue, and everybody would be welcome to that. That will be only the first of a number of initiatives that will take place in Europe, and also possibly in Seoul, Korea, in the proximity to Taiwan. That will be an ongoing effort to kind of continue to have these discussions take place. I'm coordinating this with Adam Nosek from Arizona State University, who is the director of the Center of Philosophical Technologies there. And from then on, there will be some other initiatives probably in Amsterdam, because he works primarily in architecture and engineering. So it's very interdisciplinary in terms of how we approach this topic. However, I'm also producing, this will be a part of a theoretical work, which will be the 2nd volume of this book, which is Philosophy After Friendship. So this talk basically today is drawn from a chapter of that book that I'm completing right now. And it addresses what could be called a deconstruction of the Westphalian peace as one of the most important factors in understanding the return of return of the question of the balance of Europe in response today to the war in Ukraine. The second part of my study, from which today's talk is explicitly drawn, concerns what I'm calling the conceptual persona, which is drawn from Deleuze, who I've written quite a bit about, the conceptual persona of what I'm calling the partisan philosopher. So in 1962 lecture, Theory of the Partisan, Carl Schmitt invoked this history of the Westphalian peace in describing the legal code of international law that was established to make possible a limited or bracketed war on the European continent, thereby protecting the boundaries between the temporal states of war and peace, and providing the juridical and diplomatic terms to distinguish between just or legal war between existing nation-states and an indefinite or unlimited civil or partisan warfare, especially in the context of the various imperial, neo-colonial, and nationalist revolutions in North Africa, Southeast Asia, India, Pakistan, and especially at that time in Cuba and Latin America. It's around the appearance of the figure of the partisan that Schmitt turns to an analysis of a reform-minded Prussian military officer, who you are all familiar with, Karl von Clausewitz, who in On War from 1808 was the first to address these problems of the partisan warfare to the classical theory of warfare that is caused by a new existence of partisan strategies and tactics of warfare. And it is precisely in this context that we find the original proposition that war is merely the continuation of politics by another means. Of course, as many in the audience already recognize, this proposition has undergone many inversions and substitutions. First by Althusser in his 1969 essay, published immediately after May 68, which will become significant, Lenin in Philosophy, who substitutes philosophy for war. In other words, philosophy is a certain continuation of politics in a certain domain, vis-a-vis a certain reality. I repeat Althusser's inversion or substitution simply because I enjoy his humorous habit of endlessly qualifying statements or overdetermination, in this instance, of the three primary terms: philosophy, politics, and I would say a certain reality of the war. Perhaps the most well-known inversion, which you might be familiar with, was by Foucault at the beginning of his lectures in 1975, Society Must Be Defended, 7 years after, and Foucault is explicitly responding to Althusser and Althusserian Marxism in these lectures at the beginning, and his formula is that politics is the continuation of war. So it's a more direct inversion. It might appear like a more straightforward and conceptually simple inversion, minus reality as a third term, although, as I've discussed elsewhere, it is a bit more complicated than that. However, Foucault's formulation is not going to be my subject today. As I will return to discuss in the conclusion of my talk, in a recent op-ed by Marxist theorist and former student of Althusser, Etienne Balibar, who refers to the famous formula somewhat dismissively as, quote, a common slogan that we, the left, never tire of repeating, unquote. Even though he certainly must be aware that this slogan first entered the canon of Western Marxist philosophy precisely through Vladimir Lenin's early and quite original appropriation of Clausewitz's analysis of the partisan warfare to define the figure of the partisan philosopher as a new conceptual persona in the global revolutionary warfare carried out against Western imperialism. In fact, it is Lenin's theory of the partisan that Schmitt explicitly identifies as a completely new determination of the enemy concept, which, according to his argument, has resulted in nothing less, according to Schmitt, has resulted in nothing less than the complete destruction of the concept of a limited or bracketed war that the Congress of Vienna had hoped to restore the European continent and to the world after World War II. As a result of this deformation, according to Clausewitz, that war is ideally the continuation of politics, Lenin introduces in 1916 from Finland, on the eve of the Second Revolution, Russian Revolution, Schmitt says, has now become hopelessly lost in the historical, philosophical diversions and genealogies around this original proposition, including, I will argue, the theoretical diversions and genealogies that we, on the left, have primarily inherited from a certain tradition of post-1968 French Marxist theory, since it is Althusser after the events of May 68, but from his academic position as a leading philosopher in the Sorbonne, who explicitly assumes Lenin's prototypical role of the partisan philosopher. For example, I recall the famous line from Lenin in Philosophy that, quote, all philosophy is partisan, who is then followed in this gesture by students whose names most of you are very well aware of today: Badiou, Balibar, Macherey, Rancière. But it has now been over 60 years since Schmitt's analysis of the geopolitical situation, mainly in response to the colonial, nationalist, and imperial wars, Southeast Asia, Cuba, Latin America, including Peru, El Salvador, Nicaragua, which I was involved with in the 80s, and Africa, including Congo, Somalia, Nigeria, Zimbabwe, and South Africa. And lastly, the Palestinian occupation and the war between Israel and Egypt. Since then, indeed, there have been many more imperialist and partisan wars, too many, it seems, to count, including Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. And lastly, there's the war in the Ukraine today. What do we make of that? Therefore, I will take Balibar's offhanded comment to confirm that we have lost the original problematic underlined by this proposition, and so in the first part of my talk, I will return to analyze Lenin's earlier appropriation of Clausewitz's proposition, which he then transforms into a revolutionary slogan that has become commonplace axiom both in traditional Marxism and leftist philosophy, particularly in the West, more generally, and which today has become hopelessly contradictory in its ability to distinguish between a politics of war and peace, as Schmitt, in fact, in the book in '62, or in the essays, originally feared. And indeed today, the war, in response to the war in Ukraine, may signal the end of an orthodox and polemical, primarily Leninist Bolshevik, tradition of partisan philosophy, especially, as I will argue, in the current context. Part one of my talk is called The Birth of the Partisan Philosopher. In 1915, while in exile in Switzerland during the war, Lenin closely studied Clausewitz's On War. You can find, in fact, copies of the manuscript, which includes all of Lenin's annotations, and took copious notes that will essentially become the argument of imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, in 1916, right on the eve of the revolution. What did Lenin learn in his study of Clausewitz? According to Schmitt, what Lenin was able to learn from Clausewitz, and what he learned painstakingly, was not only the famous formula of war as a continuation of politics, it was the further recognition that the distinction of friend and enemy in a revolutionary struggle is primary, and but that it practically serves to orient the public or the people or the troops to the future goals of both war as well and the party to post-revolutionary politics. In applying this lesson to the possibility of absolute hostility, which is one of the characteristics that is found among the partisan figure in Schmitt's study, and also appears in an early article that actually was published after the first failed revolution in 1905, to the counter-revolutionary enemy, Lenin quickly adopts the figure of the partisan or the partisan struggle also to apply to interior, intra-civil society struggles with counter-revolutionary enemies, for instance, as well as members of the other parties, Mensheviks and others. You can find this, for instance, in Left-Wing Communism or an Infantile Disorder, love the title, and as well as some other texts that he publishes between 1905, but particularly around World War I, which is I'm going to concentrate on in a moment, which is, of course, as you know, the failure of the Second International. As Hans Halveg, the editor of the German edition of Lenin's notebooks, observes, quote, now the whole core question of revolution is in its struggle the recognition of the essence, class analysis of world war, together with the attendant problems of opportunism, defense of the fatherland, the fight for national liberation, the distinction between just and unjust war, and the end of imperialist wars through an internal revolt of the working class, becomes the revision or the revised vision of the Bolshevik program under Lenin's analysis, and this is where he employs, in a sense, the figure of the partisan as an essential component or figure of the revolutionary struggle, particularly in the imperialism context. In his polemical writings against Kautsky and Plekhanov, both during and immediately after World War I, Lenin decried the sophistry of the bourgeois nationalism and chauvinistic patriotism to justify French working classes shooting at German working classes, and employed the tactical adoption of the enemy concept to break up and prevent any international consciousness of the working classes. For instance, Lenin's text, The Collapse of the Second International, or again, Leftist Communism or an Infantile Disorder. I say that again because I just like the title so much. In one sense, this means that a limited or bracketed concept of bourgeois warfare that was first established in the 1907 Hague Convention is itself only a diversion, if not a sham, designed to pull the wool over the eyes of the international proletariat. Lenin's argument. These wars are not intended as an end of war, not perpetual peace, but only the continuation of bourgeois politics on a global scale of imperial wars never before seen in history. Thus, Lenin's strategic response is the adoption of a total partisan warfare on the same scale as global imperialism, the same military and economic theater of the imperialist war, so to speak, in order to bring about an absolute and final war, after which only there will be anything established like a final peace. And of course, that notion of peace then becomes extremely redefined within the context of socialism, or in a sense, the state of communism. Thus, war is simply grasped politically and strategically as a, quote, expedient, a means to bring about not the end of war, which is a relative and temporary peace, a temporal suspension of war belonging to a treaty of peace, as Kant actually had already argued in the Perpetual Peace Treaty of 1795, but rather total revolution, that is, international civil war. And supposedly after this, a perpetual peace defined as the end of politics and a classless society, either without a state form, according to the earlier utopian myth of Marx, or leading to a long transitional state of the dictatorship of the proletariat, according to Lenin and Stalin. Of course, these positions are already well known, especially by we on the left. However, to examine the definition of war as another means than politics in the original proposition, I'll briefly pause to ask 4 questions. By what means? First, what is the means of war? Second, what is the means of politics that is different from the means of war? Third, what is the means of philosophy that is different from the means of politics? And finally, fourth, what is a means? What do means mean? In reply, I will simply say a means is an expedient. What is an expedient? An expedient derived from the Latin expedire and the Middle English verb to expedite is simply the definition of a certain kind of means, basically a means of attaining an end, especially one that is convenient, but is often considered improper or immoral. When it comes to historical rationalizations of war, for instance, the war in Ukraine, particularly the defense and the necessary uses of war as an expedient to attain an end of politics, unfortunately, we always begin thinking in propositions that go back to our first lessons on power and violence in nursery school, when the teacher first taught us why it is not good to shout or hit the other children, and how to shape our anger into polity or polite discourse. That is, how to avoid war by employing techniques of polity and even as a means of repression or control of violence. In fact, one can find this basic lesson concerning polity and war, and thus the same formula, at the very basis of the most sophisticated political and diplomatic communications between the nations today. For example, Biden recently visited Asia in May 2022, and in the news briefings in Japan declared that if China invades Taiwan, the United States will intervene militarily. In response, Beijing issued an official communication to the US saying that it was, quote, playing with fire. Now, these statements employ a belligerent and bellicose rhetoric that are essentially no different than the one we witnessed with two bullies on the kindergarten playground. In fact, there's no difference at all in terms of the very substance of the comments. One belligerent shouts from the sandbox, "You better watch it, I'm going to punch you in the face." The other responds, "Oh yeah, you and what army?" Since the understanding of war as a means to an end, the destruction of the enemy in the name of security, peace, or basically territory, applies equally to the playground as it does to the most sophisticated discourse of statecraft today, perhaps it's appropriate to begin an analysis of the simplest interpretation of the proposition. War is simply another means to the same end. The following definition is the phrase "the means to an end" is used to describe things that a person considers to be necessary to suffer through in order to accomplish their real goals, which may be stated or unstated, implicit or public. When a person is described as a means to an end, it means another person is using them as an expedient tool to get what they want. It is clear that Kant had this definition in mind, definition of the expedient in mind, in terms of his distinction of the hypothetical imperative from the categorical imperative, defining the human as an end in itself, which should never be utilized as a means, as in the philosophy of utilitarianism. Like all wars, however, revolutions and civil wars are certainly not peaceful, but rather the continuation of politics that includes bloodshed, death, famine, ecological devastation, economic hardship for the populations, especially in modern warfare, when a newly armed proletariat class emerges on the battlefield who can always one day turn their weapons against the bourgeoisie that sent them to war, which has happened, of course, beginning with the Russian Revolution. Thus, as Lenin concluded on the eve of World War I, war, even world war, is the absolute necessary phase that belongs to the revolutionary struggle in the last stage of capitalist history. And so the terrors of war must not only be allowed, they must be absolutely encouraged in order to create the necessary socio-economic conditions for revolutions to happen. In other words, once again, war and the general horrors associated with modern wars that are increasingly waged with or in and among the populations must be accepted as a necessary expedient that leads directly or indirectly, in some cases, to revolution. In any case, as Paul Matic, who is a Marxist figure that I have been reading quite a bit of over the last year, who was a German council communist who had lived in exile in Chicago, was mostly a trade union organizer in Chicago, but wrote extensively and was a very extreme critic of Bolshevism, has observed what revolutions have, whatever revolutions that have taken place, and this is a comment I think that was made, I can't remember the year, but it was probably in the 20s. What revolutions that have taken place, the Paris Commune and the revolutions of the 20th century in Russia and Central Europe, grew not out of economic crises, or only secondarily, but out of war and defeat and the general miseries associated with them, unquote. Foucault later confirms this by saying that any temporary state of peace is determined by, quote, the last battle in the last war, which is always maintains and in fact institutes all of the new imbalances and injustices that become the cause of the first battle in the next war. And the war in Ukraine, from a certain perspective, that is, from the perspective of Putin, is clear evidence of this thesis. However, it is this temporal order of first the war and then the revolution, which belongs to classical Marxist-Leninist theory, that I want to highlight throughout this talk. And I will return to it, particularly in the conclusion of my talk, where I take up some responses by Balibar and Badiou to the war in Ukraine. In other words, first the war, or multiple wars waged over a long duration, as prophesied by Marx in the Grundrisse as a series of cataclysms, explosions, and catastrophes that precede the end of capitalism. Afterwards, the revolution, or multiple national and neo-colonial revolutions, as Lenin revised this fundamental principle of the end of capitalism in Marxism after the Russian Revolution. But through these the long duration of national and neo-colonial wars, which are not themselves communist in essence, there will be created essentially an international character of an international class of proletariat, according to the thesis. But as Maddock explains, while the two different social revolutions cannot occur together in one particular nation, again, this would be a civil war which dissolves the legal personality of the nation itself, in which case there is no law and no class consciousness. They may occur simultaneously in an international setting, which may change international class structure in such a way as to lead to the dominance of the proletariat over the whole revolutionary process, just as the diversity of the developmental stages of various national entities does not prevent capitalism's overall rule over the global economy, unquote. Again, I think Maddock is pretty brilliant in terms of his very early analysis of these issues. For example, as Kautsky said of World War I, quote, after the war, after the debacle of government, we may get strength enough to conquer the political power, unquote. This was in a letter to Lenin. Likewise, in a letter to Gorky, written in 1913, Lenin exclaimed that, quote, a war between Austria and Russia would be a very useful thing, again, an expedient for revolutions throughout Eastern Europe. But it is not very probable that Franz Joseph and Nicky will give us the pleasure. 3 years later, of course, on the eve of the first proletariat revolution in Europe, quote, Lenin vehemently rejected and polemicized any socialist call, including those by Kautsky and Plekhanov, for ending the imperialist war on the basis of the war's destructiveness of both human lives and capitalist property, but rather pursued every means for actually turning the imperial war into a civil war. In his notebooks on Book 2 of On War, Lenin actually compares the difference between the concept of a limited territorial war put in place after the French Revolution, so the Westphalian peace, which becomes the basis for the European international order, and the concept of absolute war, to the difference between a real war and a game in the Russian Igra. Moreover, absolute war knows no limitation and no bracketing by any international law, which was conceived in the first place by bourgeois nations and by the modern European monopolies precisely as a legal means of extorting labor and booty, a word that Lenin liked to use. I'm not sure what the Russian translation of booty is. I'm not booty, B-O-T-T-Y, not the B, B-O-D-Y. Or later in the post-war World War II period, what is called the developing world, the third world, or today, the global south. Remember the word booty and looting. You will hear these words appear again from a very recent context. This underlines Schmitt's first major concern over Lenin's theory of the partisan, which is that in a civil war there is no law but a state of nature, as in the philosophy of Hobbes and especially Kant, who defined the 18th century nation-states as still existing in a state of nature or barbarism, given the asymmetrical relationship between civil law governing the conduct of individual citizens within nations and the international laws, the weak and non-existent international laws that regulate the conduct of the nation-states themselves, which is still true today. It is in Towards Perpetual Peace that Kant first presents a division between peremptory, the juridical notion of peremptory and conclusive right, and provisional right, which violates the strictest moral principles of right, but is permissible because it is either impossible to enforce it as a positive law, as in the case of enforcing the Russia or having a penalty against Russia for the invasion of Ukraine. There's no international law or force of international law that can enforce that as a law, as a conclusive right, but only as a provisional right or an objection, which then becomes the substance of a moral concept and not a juridical or legal concept. So, because it is impossible to enforce, or because there's a certain kind of permissibility of wars that happen because they may lead to the future of a better state. And this is something that Kant lays open, that, you know, we can accept that certain wars, certain devastation, certain destruction, certain violation of countries' rights and that sort of thing have to be allowed to exist because they could lead to a better condition later on. For example, as he says throughout Perpetual Peace, the right of war, jus belli, is belli, is certainly morally objectionable, and yet because it remains the founding principle of national right at this historical moment, meaning 1795, but I would say today as well, it will legally be permitted to continue as long as the principles of international law are not strong enough to prohibit it as a political practice between nations. As Kant writes in the second definitive article of Perpetual Peace, which is structured as a treaty, a peace treaty, but a peace treaty for a perpetual peace rather than a temporary peace, which we'll talk about at the end or in our questions. The fact, it says, if the right to go to war cannot properly be conceived as an element of the right of nations. If such a right is conceivable at all, it would amount to this: that in the case of men who are so disposed, it is quite right for them to destroy and devour one another, and thus to find perpetual peace only in a ditch dug into the earth. It's a pretty prophetic statement about the Holocaust, I think. So to chase away any kind of objections that Kant is just simply following a kind of Westphalian logic, here you can see he completely opposes the fundamental premise of the Westphalian peace, which is the autonomy and the sovereignty of the nation state over its own internal territory, as well as by the right to go to war as the first premise of all international law, bourgeois international law of the nation states. In the case of civil war, however, there can be no legal right claimed by either side, and thus no concepts of either a just or illegal war, or even illegal acts of war, that because in a sense there is no one to prosecute them. No rules to prohibit certain acts of war, such as the murder and wounding of enemy conducts or the genocide of civilian populations. One can see again this principle applied to the war in Ukraine today by some of its more Machiavellian proponents. Since all juridical determinations are provisional in the international context, given that there's strictly no rule of law that binds the state actors themselves, as in the case of individual citizens in civil society, the concepts of war and peace, and here I'm giving you an explanation of why they're completely useless as a philosophical, conceptual, juridical, diplomatic, and legal terms, they have been fundamentally and horribly polemicized throughout the last 200 years. That is to say, according to Schmitt, and this is in a sense that Schmitt sees also in the case of Lenin, that Lenin had shifted the conceptual center of gravity from war to politics, a logic and polemics, a polemical determination of these concepts. A logical continuation of the idea of war is itself the continuation of politics. This is a statement that occurs directly in Lenin's text on imperialism, the last stage of capitalism. Therefore, here we see it was actually Lenin, not Foucault, who was the first who inverted Clausewitz's original proposition into the slogan, politics is the continuation of war by other means. This politicization becomes the basic principle for the violent rejection of any expression of pacifism in the tradition of the Marxist-Leninist philosophy historically, after the collapse of the Second International, which was the cause of the failure of the Second International during the period of World War I, which today has become the automatic rejection of any proposal of peace as nothing more than an ideological attempt to ameliorate the real contradictions and conditions caused by Western imperialism, particularly in the form of colonial possessions. At the same time, the other side of this is the willingness to tolerate and even to encourage every catastrophe and destruction caused by the imperial wars, and thus basically under the pseudo-bracketed concept of international law as a critique, can also be compared to the numbers of dead tallied in games. Therefore, according to Lenin's dictum, in order to be for the revolution, one must be for the war. Moreover, one must be all in, as one might say in a game of poker, in a desperate move that could either signal a winning or losing hand. Moreover, one must be willing to risk everything and everyone in the wars. Of course, the position was codified in the April thesis of 1917 that openly supported the principle of Russian defeatism as a condition for ceding Western Ukraine to the Germans as a delaying tactic to allow the establishment of the Bolshevik Party's political power over the other counter-revolutionary factions and the foreign invaders during this period of time. Since it was only through the increase of social misery, human death, and the destruction of infrastructure leading to the complete collapse of both economy and government that the Bolsheviks finally would have any hope of gaining control of the state. The second major concern expressed by Schmitt, which is now I'm going to transition to the second part of my paper, it refers again to the fundamental change in the enemy concept that this facilitated politically but also philosophically. As a result of Lenin's identification of the real enemy as the absolute class enemy in most, if not all, international wars. However, in the case of intra-national civil wars or revolutions, in his writings around the period of the Russian Revolution and the struggle of the Bolsheviks to take control of the Communist Party apparatus, the external enemy is replaced by a number of internal class enemies who are represented by a number of other parties and factions, including philosophical ones. Mensheviks, anarchists, bourgeois socialists, leftists, etc., including Lenin's own former mentor, Kautsky. In other words, according to Schmitt, war became absolute war, and the partisan became the bearer, and remember this, of absolute enmity and hostility directed against an abstract and in some way redefinable enemy. But this immediately induces a problem of irregularity of the partisan, which is dependent upon the nature of the regularity of a standing army whose violence or war power, Wehrmacht, is limited or bracketed by the rules of conduct, the sovereignty of law, including the Geneva Conventions. In the case of absolute war against an absolute and thus abstract and non-Tellurian enemy, on the other hand, there can be no limit to violence and class hatred that is unleashed by a popular partisan struggle, which can also be strategically amplified by other forms of enmity that exist already in civil society, such as racism, nationalism, and religious enmity, as we have witnessed over the last, I don't know, since the beginning of human history, I guess. But anyway, but we have particularly witnessed this in many of the revolutionary wars that have occurred in the 20th and 21st century, and today in the war in Ukraine. On one side, we have animals, even though animals do not actually rape other animals in invading their territory. On the other side, we have neo-Nazis, if not Nazis, and Satanists. The unleashing of an absolute spirit of nationalist chauvinism and patriotism of the partisan was the problem that occupied Clausewitz, particularly given the success of the Spanish guerrillas after 1808, when he saw superior strength of the irregular partisan force against the 18th century regular Napoleonic army, particularly when the peasant and uneducated citizen was armed not only with weapons, but with the strength of absolute enmity and hatred for basically the foreign enemy or the occupier. In turn, this is a brilliant lightning flash of the same idea that later inspired Mao, particularly in view of the political dependency on basically an uneducated peasant population in waging the colonial wars against the foreign occupier in China. Nevertheless, Lenin was the first to embrace this risky gamble, again I return to the gamble and to the metaphor of the game, as willing to, in a sense, gamble this as a regulative solution leading to revolution, which was the investment of all control, but basically it would be regulated by the investment of all political control and military control in the centralization of the party apparatus, who would fundamentally control not only the regular army, the Red Army in both cases, but fundamentally also to deal with the partisan armies that were unleashed at the beginning of the war. This was Mao's solution, who calculated a necessary, actually in the Red Book, a necessary ratio between the composition of partisan and regular Red Army as 9 to 10, 9 over 10, which is, say, 1/10 of the regular army which was held in reserve until the end of the war when, quote, the situation is mature enough for the communist regime, at which point the regular army is often unleashed against the partisan army in order to exterminate them. In the case of Lenin and the Bolsheviks, however, the peasantry would have to be neutralized, for example, as Stalin did between 1933 and 35 in the Ukraine, one way or another, no matter which class, bourgeoisie, proletariat, should come into possession of the Russian state. Finally, from this first section, the third major concern is the figure of Lenin himself as a new conceptual persona of the professional revolutionary. Now, Schmitt uses this term in 1960, the professional revolutionary, very intentionally, which according to Schmitt's use of the term should be heard in the same sense as the professional soldier, on the side of the bourgeois order of standing armies under international law. However, it is Matik's earlier critique of Bolshevism as the official ideology of the Russian Revolution after 1916 that a new kind of professional revolutionary basically invented by Lenin that gets to the core of the problematic relationship between philosophy and insurrectionist politics, or between partisan theory and partisan practice, which is in the Marxist-Leninist mode. Already after 1903, Lenin's strategic program for organizing the Russian Revolution between three major parties, the bourgeoisie capitalists and the young intelligentsia, the Russian peasantry and the industrial working class, which is quite small, implied different political techniques that needed to be employed for disciplining each class. These three classes would have to participate equally in the overthrow of the Tsarist regime. But since this would only lead to the reassertion after the revolution of self-interest that defined each class in the post-revolutionary system, only one class could serve as a dominant political class of the state that is constructed afterwards. Quote, this is Matik again. Logically, Matik writes, the bourgeoisie would have to be the ruling class, if only because it would be the class from which the educated intelligentsia of the new communist society originates. However, it is in this final point that Lenin adds one rejoinder that is taken from Marx's third thesis on Feuerbach. The educators themselves must first be educated. In other words, the members of the bourgeoisie intelligentsia who would become the vanguard of the revolution and the leaders of the state must be organized, disciplined, and subordinated to the control of their leaders of the Bolshevik party in the same way that a professional army is trained for a military campaign. Now, this is something that Mao also adopted, but actually applied in a much more literal way. If you read the Red Book, everything is, in a sense, an understanding that there's no difference between the military organization and the organization of civil society. At this point, let's return now, finally, to Schmitt's 1962 analysis of the theory of the partisan, where he makes a similar, if not same, critique of Lenin's role as the philosopher, poet, dictator of the Bolshevik Revolution. Quote, the new reality conceived with philosophical consciousness by a Russian revolutionary Lenin and the alliance of philosophy and the partisan he forged unleashed unexpected new and explosive forces. Now, this is very important. Therefore, in asking what is at stake when bourgeois philosophy generally becomes a partisan philosophy, Schmitt returns to a figure who emerges after the French revolutions of 1789 and 1993. Quote, a great and courageous thinker of the Ancien Regime, Joseph de Maistre, had foreseen brilliantly what's at stake. What he feared most was an academic Pugachev. That is, he took great pains to make clear what he considered to be the real danger, namely the alliance of philosophy with the elemented forces of insurrection, which is quite an amazing kind of broadcast or forecast of what emerges. Schmitt constantly in his argument at this point italicizes that this is his real concern, is the entrance of the philosopher into the stage to become the combination of the philosopher and the partisan in one figure. And it is the academic Pugachev, the illiterate Cossack, actually he was literate, who in 1772 decreed the abolition of serfdom and gathered a substantial partisan army, including the Yak, the Cossacks, and the peasant workers in the mines and the factories of the Urals, and the agricultural peasants from the eastern Ukraine. Why is this a deadly combination of the partisan leader with an academic philosopher so important for Schmitt? Is it either to underscore the absurdity of this figure appearing in history, similar to Kant's portrayal of the philosopher who is described as, in a sense, playing a game of skittles on the floor underneath the feet of the statesman in the beginning, in which, in a sense, the philosopher is never to be feared because the philosopher is always too pedantic, otherworldly, simplistic, and childish and naive, as someone who might even propose something like perpetual peace? Or is it because he sees that there might be an even greater danger in this new and unique combination, which might unleash a certain kind of children's crusade against basically the world? Finally, concerning the problem of absolute enmity released by this new conceptual persona of the professional partisan philosopher, this must be distinguished from Mao Zedong's contribution to the theory of the partisan during the Chinese Revolution, but also later in enlisting the students into the formation of the Red Guard in 1966 to wage a partisan struggle against the bourgeois rotors and the four olds that existed in the CCP, with his mantra, explode or bomb the party headquarters. That was what he told the students to do. Mao's concept of partisan was, however, from Schmitt's perspective, Tellurian, meaning from the earth. Therefore, the enmity is always directed against a foreign occupier or colonial presence, and not an abstract class enemy that can be internationalized, as in the case of Lenin. For instance, here are the first lines of the March of the Volunteers, which were originally adopted as the national anthem, but the original title was the March of the Anti-Manchukuo Counter-Japanese Volunteers, meaning the March of the Partisans against Japan. Arise, ye who refuse to be slaves. With our flesh and bones, let us build our new great wall. The Chinese people face their greatest danger. From each one of you comes the urgent call to action. Arise, 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 unquote. As an aside, this national anthem was officially banned last summer when it was used online by Chinese in Shanghai to protest the lockdown brought about by the zero COVID policy. So the CCP actually banned their own national anthem, which is quite amazing. As Schmitt first observes, here lies the deepest origin of the ideological difference between the Soviet communism and Chinese communism. Okay, I'm going to skip down to the second part so we can complete on time. The second part is shorter and it's called The Ghosts of the Dialectic. And this is the part that has a little bit more, well, not that the first part wasn't already sexy, but the second part's a little bit more. Okay, today as a result of the above historical diversions and genealogies, the problem now becomes how the divorce of the philosophical and ideological authority of this position of the academic partisan philosopher from the concrete practical activities of political organization can fundamentally distort, or let's say the marriage rather than divorce, can fundamentally distort the unified perspective of both philosophical, academic, and political activity. Moreover, given, which are two aspects of the mode of production and the relations of production, so you can't combine these without, in a sense, changing the very fundamental notion of labor. Moreover, given the history of partisan polemics are mostly directed against socialist and later Marxist philosophers in national universities, beginning with Engels' polemical and vituperate attack of Herr Düring in 1878, how can this development in political philosophy be seen as anything else but another betrayal of the proletariat and the working classes by the bourgeois national intelligentsia that contradicts the whole logic of the professional revolutionary subject? In what way does academic authority over younger generations of bourgeois intellectual and political life lead to a fundamental contradiction in the theory of partisan philosophy? Well, this is a contradiction that has repeatedly and constantly reappeared within the Marxist tradition itself, beginning with Engels and the young Hegelians and the battle against the young Hegelians, and then later on carried out by Lenin against Mach and the empirical criticists. And you can see, in a sense, it gives birth to a certain kind of polemics that is used in academic discourse in relation to a warfare conducted by words. In the introduction to this lecture, I've already referred to Balibar's op-ed that was published online in 2022, which I was first struck by the contradictions to, quote, the correct position of traditional dogmatic Marxist interpretation of the war. The article is titled, Ukraine's Sovereignty Depends Upon NATO. We are all in the war, unquote. And I remember immediately thinking to myself, well, this is a very strange thing for a Marxist to say. Of course, here Balibar is responding, as he says, both with and against his own camp, in refuting many of the earliest interpretations of the war by his fellow campers. I do not need to rehearse these arguments in detail since we've all heard the same arguments for the last 100 years. As the editorial heading reads, quote, the response of the intellectual left to Russia's war against Ukraine has largely involved blaming NATO and aversion to any kind of military involvement, a generic calls to pacifism. But in understanding this war involves recognizing some of the realities that the intellectual left finds uncomfortable. NATO is not the aggressor. Russia is. This is Balibar. Ukrainians are driven by a form of nationalism, and there is no meaningful sense of national sovereignty independent of the powerful guarantors, even if this will mean a new form of dependency of the Ukraine on NATO itself, and not only that, but on EU and the United States. Again, I thought, wow, this is a really interesting thing for a Marxist to say. And I was a student of Balibar in the early 90s as well. But I was more surprised by Balibar's conditional approval of the call made by the Italian Marxist Sandro Mazzadra that, quote, we must desert the war. We must desert the war. We have no choice, alas, my friend, the philosopher Sandro Mazzadra proposes in a beautiful lesson in revolutionary pacifism to, quote, desert the war. Yet this immediately begs a question. Which war? What war exactly are we deserting? Or ought we desert? The current nationalist war, which Balibar defines as the Ukrainian war for independence that was suspended and left in abeyance in 1991 and whose bill has finally come due. The European Civil War, which began in 1914 and not in the 1848 revolutionary wars that spread across the European continent and into the 20 and 21st century. Because as Balibar explains, because the history of European communism is an integral part of the larger and more complex cycle, that of the European Civil War that began in 1914, linking the imperialist war and the revolution, unquote. Or finally, the third war, the war against Western imperialism and global capitalism itself, since after World War II, primarily against the global hegemony of the United States, an enemy that has both evolved theoretically, practically, and politically during the intervening century. In responding to this question and attempting to define the complex and overdetermined structure of the war, or the wars, I find it symptomatic that Balibar's own arguments in this op-ed that is intended to very simply for a public clarify what should be the correct position of the left right now to the war, become horribly convoluted and disorienting in terms of how to interpret the war, indicating perhaps a crisis within the orthodox or dogmatic principles of the theory that even he's employing in a kind of chauvinistic and nationalistic way, thus describing the current war as an overdetermination of the fundamental contradictions of the current moment. However, in defining the World War I as a European civil war, he also appeals to the classical topos between the difference between a so-called legal war and the absolute final war that would end this long period between war and revolution. Moreover, in the historical condensation, repetition, and displacement of this overdetermination of the war, which are the three wars or the inability to determine which war that we're in, not only, he says, concerning, quote, our judgment of its historical character, but as he says, but also our idea of politics it calls for, or conversely, it prohibits. But here, in the balance of the conclusion of my talk, I will ask, what is the nature of the moral judgment that claims the power to prohibit an idea of politics? In response to this question, I will hazard a symptomatic interpretation, as Althusserians like to say, that after a long historical detour in theory, we have returned exactly to September 15th, 1915. That is, to the middle of the war, and to that fatal decision that resulted in the collapse of the Second International, and which splits the correct position with regard to the idea of the revolutionary politics into two extremely opposed but equally orthodox camps. Nevertheless, my hypothesis can be easily confirmed by referring to the conclusion of Mazadra's March 22 op-ed, which Balabar quotes from. Quote, "In recent days, there were calls from Russia and Ukraine for a new Zimmerwald, that is, a conference in the vein of the one in Switzerland that convened socialists who opposed the war in September 1915. We don't know if this is an actual concrete call, and surely the situation today is completely different than a century ago, but it is a powerful suggestion and it deserves to be taken up," unquote. Although, as Balabar qualifies any enthusiasm for such a proposal, we should not let ourselves be mobilized and carried away by it in an unreflective way. The margin of choice is very frail, but perhaps we should not decide in advance to be against it. In other words, if my hypothesis of the historical repetition is correct, and the contemporary tradition of Marxist theory is grounded on nothing more than a series of historical condensations and displacements of this very same moment, it appears that there's a desire to return back to this fateful decision and choose, quote, a different camp. Therefore, according to the same symptomatic interpretation, I would even claim that Balabar reappears to us today in the flesh as our contemporary Kautsky. That is, the Sakharov-conciliatory chauvinist, as Lenin called him, in left-wing communism or an infantile disorder, who has the moral timidity to propose that the principle of self-determination and independence gives the Ukrainian proletariat the right to defend itself, and not only that, but to kill with the greatest violence possible all of the Russian proletariat. Okay. Of course, if Balabar can be viewed as our contemporary Kautsky, it is Badiou who appears today as the hybrid persona of Lenin and Mao, which introduces the last dialectical evolution in the conceptual personage of the partisan philosopher, one that even resembles what Schmitt revered most, an academic Pugachev. Because of lack of time, however, I can only briefly refer to a recent propaganda piece that was published in the journal Crisis and Critique, edited by friends Frank Ruda and Agon Hamza. I had an article published in the previous issue on Spinoza. But the article is called Politics Today, 13 Theses and Commentaries, which, quote, proposes a new conceptual framework having learned the lessons from previous historical failures that will allow the conception and practical articulation of what a yet invented politics must be. Here we should again underline the function of philosophical thesis in Althusser is not emulating scientific propositions that can be verified empirically or scientifically as either true or false, but as dogmatic statements that dictate the, quote, correct position with regard to the whole or totality, history, primarily history, the world, end of capitalism. Thus, recalling my question concerning what form of politics or idea of politics claims the authority to prohibit certain ideas, the answer would be what Althusser first outlined in Lenin philosophy as a non-philosophical practice of philosophy. That is, a practical or pragmatic and dogmatic practice that is attached and basically emulated by his work during this period of time. And that Badiou is taken up and incarnated in almost all of his writings, particularly when they take on a pragmatic approach of the partisan philosopher. For example, Badiou's interpretation of the current contradiction representing Russia's invasion of Ukraine more clearly appears in the 13th thesis, echoing the original 11th thesis of Feuerbach concerning the overall goal of changing history rather than contemplating it, right? Now, I'm always amused that anytime a contemporary Marxist publishes this genre of theses, there's always more than 11. As if we have to add a few more because history's kind of gone on, or because of the repeated failures, right? Under such conditions, only one, quote, I'm quoting Badiou, under such condition, only one uncontrolled military incident suffices to bring everything to the brink of war. The sides are already drawn. The United States and their Western Japanese clique on one side, and on the other, China and Russia. Nuclear weapons proliferate. Western Japanese clique. If you excuse my French, what the fuck is that? Okay, I don't even know, but sometimes I have the feeling that Badiou stopped looking at the external reality sometime in the early 70s, if not in 1968. I can only assume that this motley crew of imperial pirates that he lists and the band of looters, I'll read a passage in a moment, echoes the original list by Lenin that is clearly invoked by Badiou, in fact plagiarized, including the strange reference to the friend-enemy opposition as being the United States and their Western Japanese clique on one side and China and Russia on the other. Can only assume that Badiou is either consciously or unconsciously citing Lenin's own original text without understanding that Lenin had coded and ciphered the listing of the countries in order to get past the Russian censors originally. For instance, in the 1920 preface to the French and German editions, he explains, capitalism has grown into the world system of the colonial oppression and the financial strangulation of overwhelming majority of people of the world by a handful of advanced countries, and this booty, quote, there we go, booty, is shared between 2 or 3 powerful world pirates to the teeth, America, Great Britain, and Japan, who involve the whole world in their war over the sharing of this booty. To illustrate another performative moment from Lenin's historical manifesto, here's a passage that basically plagiarizes. Today, the great powers seek to collaborate, maintain the stability of affairs on a global scale, notably by fighting against protectionism, but on the other hand, these same powers are blindly fighting for their individual hegemony. The result is the end of obviously colonial practice like those of 19th century France and England, the military and administrative occupation of entire countries. Okay, so I won't continue to, but anyway, this is actually a direct quote, which is not a quote, it's a direct plagiarism of Lenin's text. Consequently, if we were to update Lenin's list of world pirates, we would need to substitute EU for Great Britain, the United States, including Asian-Pacific alliance with Australia, Korea, and Japan against North Korea, China, Russia, and Iran. The second interpretation of this most recent, if not last contradiction, returns us to the question of the temporal order between war and revolution, from capitalism or the higher stage of written in Finland. Of course, I'm referring to the classical topos of Marx. Okay, I'm going to skip over this because I want to end here pretty quick. So anyway, so Badiou, in a sense, revises the order. It's not the war first and then the revolution, it's the revolution maybe and then the war. So there's this kind of reversal of the inversion of the temporality. But here lies the contradiction between these two moments. You see it both in Balabar and Badiou's responses. And the two ideological theses that precisely concern the difference between the situation of 1920 and 2022, exactly 100 years later. Here I'll briefly expound some of the differences and why they both appeal to Lenin's understanding of the relationship between war and politics. That is, between bourgeois politics and revolutionary politics, reveals a glaring contradiction in terms of the unwillingness to translate Lenin's theory of the partisan, and particularly the character of absolute hostility towards an enemy, into the current context of the war in Ukraine, as if now they're nervous about the very notion of the use of partisan warfare as a tool, in a sense, for revolutionary struggle. Okay? So, in a sense, in other words, how do we, professional revolutionaries and philosophers, identically, employ the absolute enemy of class hatred and even race hatred that Lenin found to be an essential tool in the revolutionary struggle today? Echoing the prescription from What is to be Done, according to Badiou's revised contemporary version, here we must quote Marx's definition of the singular militant's manner of presence, mode de présence, within movements. The communists everywhere support every revolutionary movement against existing social and political order of things. In all these movements, they bring to the fore as leading question in each, the property question, not a matter of what its degree of development at the time. Here, in other words, Badiou simply substitutes the original Marxist dyad, political activists and bourgeois intelligentsia and mass proletarian labor, with a newly minted troika. One, an orthodox and increasingly senile class of pseudo-political activists and bourgeois academics of the global north. Two, youth movements, quote from Badiou, youth movements made up of privileged students mostly from the global south. And three, a mass of people, quote, who are completely destitute and thus politically dangerous. These are the three components of revolutionary struggle today. In his own words, what we need to do in the wake of, what we did in the wake of May 68, by those organizations can and must be done once again. We must reconstitute the political diagonal I spoke of, which remains today a diagonal between youth movements, various intellectuals, and a nomadic proletariat. Here there is already, in a sense, a current version of Lenin's essay, What is to be Done? But I'll stop here and now conclude. Since these arguments approach a form of scholastic philosophy in the slavish and unthinking citation of the philosophy of Aristotle and Aquinas, and today especially, I do not think we can afford any longer to interpret the material and historical reality of contemporary events, totality, and the real through these dogmatic lenses anymore, especially when reality is simply excluded or ignored altogether when it doesn't fit into the metal grid of the theory. Instead, I will conclude by referring to another set of theses concerning politics today that was published much earlier in 1950 by the German Marxist philosopher Karl Korsch. Although these theses are not dogmatic either in their form or content, but rather outline a non-dogmatic form of interpreting the war today, as well a non-dogmatic form, meaning a philosophical practice of philosophy. Writing from exile in New Orleans, Korsch, the one-time apologist of Lenin's philosophical writings, particularly materialism and empirical criticism, which had since become the required textbook on philosophy in the Soviet Union, became one of the most severe and conscientious, along with Matic, critics of the role of the Comintern and as a vehicle of ideology for the Soviet Union in scuttling any hopes from for communist internationalism outside the narrow goals of Stalinism and state capitalism. And just as in the case of the syndicalists that were also in exile in Chicago, Matic. But the mere basically, I'm going to skip this. The article I'm referring to is aptly titled 10 Theses on Marxism Today, again in the style of Marx's original thesis on Feuerbach, but refreshingly Deleuzian in its subtraction of the first principle, n-1, but also revealing that Badiou's own performative text of 13 not only implicitly responds to Korsch at this moment, but also only in order to negate this kind of idea of politics in his own response. It no longer makes sense to ask to what extent the teaching of Marx and Engels is today theoretically acceptable or practically applicable. Second maxim or thesis. Today, all attempts to reestablish the Marxist doctrine as a whole in its original function as a theory of working class social revolutions are reactionary utopias. For the first purposes of this talk, which I'm going to conclude, I will restrict my brief commentary on the fourth and the fifth theses. One, the first step in reestablishing a revolutionary theory and practice consisting in breaking with that of Marxism, which claims to monopolize revolutionary initiative as well as a theoretical and practical direction. Marx today is only, and this is the most amazing thesis, Marx is today only one of the numerous precursors, founders and developers of the socialist movement of the working classes. No less important are the so-called utopian socialists from Thomas More to the present. No less important are the great rivals of Marx, such as Blanqui and his sworn enemies such as Proudhon and Bakunin. No less important in the final result are the more recent developments as the German revisionism, French syndicalism, and at this moment including some of the theories of Russian Bolshevism as, in a sense, moments in this dialectical process. In other words, returning to the major theses put forward to Marxism and philosophy, revolutionary consciousness is bound up with a specific historical time and place. As Hegel said, a philosophy cannot be anything but its time expressed in ideas. And this would also include Marxist theoretical doctrine that materially loses its relation to the current social struggle, becomes ossified, dogmatic in form, ideological and terroristic in its practices. And I believe I demonstrated in some ways, in keeping with this Marxist materialist view, therefore, all of the earlier polemics, including those launched by Marx and Engels themselves, against Stirner, the young Hegelians, Proudhon, Bakunin against Dühring, or Lenin's polemical battles against Mach, Bogdanov, Avenaris, or later the National Socialism against Plekhanov and Kautsky, must today be submitted to a thorough deconstruction. Unfortunately, a very conservative and reactionary theoretical apparatus was installed long ago in Western universities, which successfully maintained these polemics dogmatically long after they no longer existed in flesh and bone. But they were just the ghosts of previous moments in the dialectic. I will give you an example of the most recent form of dogmatic politics, mostly organized by young student readers of Badiou. A student of mine, so I'll conclude with two examples. A student of mine, who just also happens to be from Cairo, is personally struggling with the hopelessness of his current political situation and the political class that was ruling basically in the current political Egyptian context. He became seduced into a Marxist reading group online. He participated actively in conversation over revolutionary politics with his peers of his own generation from places far and wide, from Sao Paulo to New York. He expressed himself in a manner that seemed natural and organic to his own stage of intellectual exploration. That is, with a kind of DJ spooky mix of Nietzsche, Heidegger, Marx, Gramsci, Althusser, Said, certainly, Badiou, of course, this goes without saying, and inevitably and unfortunately, in my view, the mixed master himself, Slavoj Žižek. His peers tolerated this at first, though I imagine they were very intimidated by his knowledge and his native intelligence. However, the minute that he made some minor criticisms of Stalinism, his blog interlocutors suddenly asked who authorized him to speak this way, and if the committee had basically authorized or basically approved his personal and private statements on the blog before he made them. When he reported this to me, I found this incident both incredibly comical and grotesque, since it demonstrates the return of the most sinister and repressive form of a party apparatus, a Politburo, a Comintern. A form of politics that has been, but this is a form of politics that has been spontaneously reinvented by a bunch of young Marxists who just happened to have created a blog under the command of Mao. As Badiou says, quote, "The intellectual youth has always played a key role in the birth of new politics. The continued journey towards other social strata, particularly the most deprived, where the impact of capitalism is most devastating, the global south, it is necessary." But this anecdote also reminded me immediately of a statement by Spinoza. Why do people desire their own repression? I'll conclude, and I know I'm going a little bit long, but I need to finish. I want to conclude now by giving you another more personal autobiographical anecdote from my own experience of the last 15 years in organizing the Perpetual Peace Project. Ever since I initiated the project in 2008, based mostly on the use of the preliminary and definitive articles of Kant's 1795 Perpetual Peace, and especially the later political writings, which I view, I apologize in some way, as an alternative version of universal history that might be productively and constructively placed in a dialectical relationship with the version of universal history that's proposed by Marx, primarily in the Grundrisse and by Engels. However, I have received nothing in response during this entire period of 15 years from my Marxist colleagues, even my closest and dearest friends, at least when they have chosen not simply to remain silent, but basically accept expressions of the most dogmatic and blanket rejection of Kant's entire philosophy, once again expressing a moral character of judgment that is both historical and prohibitive. Of course, ever since Engels first invented the dyad of materialism versus idealism, Kant's philosophy was summarily dismissed as idealist, a term that is especially polemicized by Lenin in his attack on Mach later on. But today, the philosopher himself is just simply condemned as a racist. What I've noticed more recently, however, and mostly coming from the mouths of the youth, is an effective intensity that approaches absolute enmity and hatred for the philosophy, if not the philosopher himself, of Kant. Kant's philosophy has become today unthinkable. For many, or as the French say, strictement défendu, or as the French say, as in the sign in the metro reads, il est strictement défendu de fumer. It's absolutely or strictly forbidden to smoke. Nevertheless, I also realized from the beginning that this judgment was not actually the result of any act of individual thinking, even when the negative is actualized through the mouths of my interlocutors. Instead, these judgments are simply the ghosts who have poured their poison into the open ears of anyone who will listen and who will continue to listen to them. And all they say is no and no and no. I stopped listening to these ghosts a long time ago. However, I will end by providing you with one final example of these ghosts who have been speaking through the mouth of Badiou, it seems forever. Quote, the lexicon used, oh, I forgot to tell you my joke about Mao swimming across the Yellow River, but anyway, the lexicon, this is a quote, and you can read it here from the same thesis that I quoted. The lexicon should be controlled and coherent. For example, today, communism is incompatible with democracy, equality is incompatible with liberty, all positive use of an identitarian vocabulary, French or international community, Islamic or Europe should be banned, as well as psychological terms desire, life, and no one, as well as all terms related to the established state systems, system, electorate, and so on. Returning to Hegel's statement that philosophers are merely the expression of ideas that are materially conditioned by their time and place is different from saying that philosophers are simply the products of their time. In fact, this is only another dogmatic thesis promulgated by Marx and Engels early on for the practical purposes precisely of fighting with the colleagues and the young Hegelians. To return to the practical goals of the Perpetual Peace Project, and this is where I'll conclude. I'll conclude by opening the website, and you can just see that while it... there we go. There we go. To return to the practical goals of the Perpetual Peace Project, I would say that the polemic of idealism versus materialism, which is today completely meaningless by the material evolution of both history and politics, although apparently not by the history of philosophy. Therefore, the absolute enmity that is still directed against Kant's philosophy is, in my view, precisely one of these dialectical ghosts we must now contend with in order to reimagine and thus to remember a politics of the future, if only to avoid repeating an idea of politics that belongs only to the past, and thus dismembering any hope of confronting the politics of the present. Thank you very much. So I can explain the project if there's any time for question. I apologize for going on longer, but I had a lot to say. So as you can see, this is the concept of this phase of the project. It focused on the Euro war in Ukraine. And I've taken the preliminary articles and tried to edit them in order to represent our current progress towards the idea of perpetual peace. And so you can see most of it's blacked out or censored, as in intelligence documents from my country, where you might have a word left on a page. So anyway, if you go to the website, please go to the website and look and learn a little bit more, not only about this phase of the project, but about all three phases, which includes films, videos, and so forth, since 2008. Thank you very much. And do we have time, or do we have to vacate the room?
Sure, we have a time for discussion. And first of all, thank you very much for brilliant argument, which for me at least in a very convincing way criticized the dogmatism and contemporary Marxism, and also show the way out. So I'm sure there will be questions, comments, complaints maybe for those who consider themselves adherents of my views. So please go ahead.
Like everybody else, I started as a Badiouian in the 80s at Berkeley, when I studied in Berkeley, reading Être et Démon. When I got to the end of the book, I found it too French to adopt, and so I basically abandoned using Badiou's theory at that point.
I have, yeah. I had a lot of thoughts and a lot of questions, which are not really to do with. I mean, I have no. I wasn't sure. I don't know if Petra had me in mind. I carry no flag for Badiou either, but I do carry a flag as a Marxist in some way, and so of course I have some doubts. But actually, I wanted to say something slightly different, which is and it's really a kind of comment that's sort of orthogonal to a lot of what you said. But it's about the thing that seems to have struck me in debating war in the past kind of couple of years, and going back, my formative political experience were opposing the invasion of Iraq, and at that time, concepts like imperialism, like opposing your own government, like cheering on the defeat of your own soldiers, were all quite important principles to actually hold. But one of the things that I really felt in the last 2 or 3 years is that one of the reasons why a certain kind of socialist or leftist discussion of the war sounds so confusing to everyone else is that precisely that our reference point is 1915 and everyone else's reference point is 1939.
That's right.
We are talking about the First World War, and everyone else is talking about the Great War against fascism.
That's right.
And so I guess I was wondering if that obviously, you stayed at the beginning of the century, not at the middle of the century, but I wondered if you thought about that.
Well, as you can see, I'm extremely familiar with both traditions and both reference points. And so that's why I really said we have returned. And the reason is there's so much confusion and contradiction in some of the traditional axioms and statements of a certain kind of leftist and Marxist position, is because there is actually a kind of repetition or condensation of that year 1915 and the split, the failure of the Second International. And I think that that's very important right now in order to interpret, in a sense, the responses to that. But earlier in the 90s, in response to globalization and the establishment of the hegemony of the United States, global capitalism, neoliberalism, then the reference point was 1939, but really 1945, with the establishment of the United Nations and particularly the IMF and the role that the IMF had in the global South, in the developing world. And so that was a very salient reference point, and there was very much still very coherent components of both national imperialist aspects of imperialism and imperialist wars that could be easily identified in the global South, and therefore positions that were consistent with that. But this is what's interesting me. This is what interested me in going to specifically Balibar and Badiou's. Badiou doesn't really ever talk about the Ukrainian war. He's only talking about, that's why the question of which war are we talking about. But Balibar does, and changes his position in a way that is contradictory to certain earlier positions, and certainly to a traditional leftist position that he would have taken and did take simply 10 years earlier. So I see that as very significant. And I think that we're in a period of the dialectical change, where the theory needs to change, right? The theory needs to evolve in terms of its theoretical construction. My concern is that what are the important centers where this theoretical kind of production and discussion is taking place? There's so much, when I'm referring to the very beginning of the Ukrainian war, all of the traditional, basically newspapers and journals and outlets that are leftist or Marxist, including Chomsky. There was just a very traditionalist response to the war in Ukraine that didn't make any sense at all. Balabar was the only one to, in a sense, kind of acknowledge this in some way. And in some way, you could see that he was just a man standing with a microphone who was completely perplexed. You know, and I consider him, he's a product of his own generation. He's a product of Althusser, of being a member of the French Communist Party for a long time and holding very orthodox positions within the academy and within his role teaching in the United States and so forth. And so I find he's probably in a very confused state right now. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to take time away from other people, but I guess, so sort of two thoughts on it. I mean, one is that I must say I feel like that state of perplexity is I feel like that is the appropriate response, in fact. Maybe that's just because it's also what I feel, and maybe that's also just because of my own, because I certainly don't have the authoritative position in academia that he has, but otherwise maybe I'm in some ways in a similar position. But I suppose thinking of, one of the reasons why I mentioned the Second World War is because by the time of the Second World War in Western Marxism, you have a much more fragmented series of identities, and in particular you have the very complicated position that Trotskyists, for example, find themselves in relation to the Second World War. And I actually think those experiences are which are an experience of profound powerlessness confronted with global power blocks throwing themselves at each other, and confronting, like there's this famous Ernest Mandel interpretation of the Second World War that it's both an inter-imperialist conflict and a national war and a series of wars for national liberation.
Right. Which is, I quote, basically I also made that statement.
Yeah, and I suppose that's one of the reasons I bring up that period is that actually I think that's closer to what it's like to be on the left, at least as I understand what it means to be on the left, is to not be in a position where we can have a Zimmerwald and split, or indeed where we can have where there can be a meaningful impact on the series of contradictions, where you can seriously call for the defeat of your own side to advance the revolution.
Yeah, this is why I focus on the friend-enemy concept, because that is a strategy in a political theory based upon a clear understanding of the ability to identify the enemy and the friend in any kind of context, colonial and imperial, and to be able to distinguish between the two types of wars. And that perplexity is the inability to distinguish between those two types of wars within the context of the Ukraine.
I think that's right.
And the other thing I would say, I completely affirm what you say. I completely affirm the affect of what you say. But what I'm calling into question, there is no correct position with regard to the contemporary moment, and that's what I'm critiquing. And that's what I'm critiquing in the Althusserian kind of reformulation of, in a sense, a kind of Bolshevik Leninist class struggle in theory moment. That began in '69, and that Badiou and Balabar, all the way up to the most recent phase, had, in a sense, held within the context of being in the academy. And when I'm also then questioning, what's the role when a public professor, in a sense, is also the political leader and professional organizer? And then the hegemony of the role of the university and the global universities in this process too, and how Marxism has emerged in that format, okay? So it's a much more complicated argument, and I'm only giving you the kind of like bellicose moment, which is a little polemical, oddly enough, and contradictory to what I'm trying to say. But in a sense, I'm just in the early process of trying to work through some of this material, and I'm reading things that were published less than 6 months ago. But let me say one more thing. I'm also an ally, or I'm also in the same state of perplexity, but this is in a very productive moment. I use the Kant as a way of responding to that
but it also drove me back to figures that I had not read in detail before, including Maddock, who I found during this, right at the beginning of the war, and it made a lot of sense to me. And then also I went back to rereading Korsch in this context. And what the Korsch is saying is very important. I mean, what I'm affirming is we need to open up all of these earlier polemic and orthodox positions, the rejection of utopianism, the rejection of anarchism, the rejection of all of these positions that people dogmatically reject just because, like, Marx and Engels reject them, you know, 150 years ago, or because Lenin rejected Kant 100 years ago. We can't afford to do, we on the left can't afford to do that anymore. We need to open up different possibilities of socialism and also the possibility of socialist theory to a new kind of theoretical question of its formulation, that's why I'm saying I think it's a dialectical moment for us. Now, I'm a student of Derrida. Derrida was my advisor, my dissertation advisor, but I'm not Derridian. I mean, most of my work is on Deleuze, if you're familiar at all with anything I've done. But when it comes to certain ways of engaging questions of politics, the question, particularly political philosophy, I suddenly become more Derridian than Deleuzian, because I find Deleuze a bit dogmatic and a bit bourgeois in his politics.
It's maybe a bit of a confusion, problematic question for me, but if you find in this discussion, because like a lot of these arguments taken from the classics and like Lenin, Marx, and Engels in these debates about peace on left is kind of from 20th century, and it's basically one position on the left, which is also, I think, Deleuzian, is like from Karl Liebknecht in 1915. This is not our war. But you can like go more back to 19th century and see, for example, what Marx and Engels said about, like, because Marx supported, like, in the war between South and North.
Yes.
He supported North because
he supported the North. He wrote to Lincoln, the famous letter to Lincoln.
And Engels said, like, if there was a war between Russia and Germany, we have to support Germany because they are on a higher civilization level.
Right.
So that's also like in this like Marxist tradition is also this like civilization kind of argument. So my question: have you found like arguments like this in these debates?
No, see, there's no, I mean, none of that early period where, again, that strategic rationalization of a certain kind of where the revolution is prepared to take place because of the advancement. This is, of course, the Menshevik argument as well. That was early, Marx and Engels' earlier argument, as you just said. Basically the idea that, in a sense, there has to be a stage or a phase of bourgeois revolution and capitalist development before any kind of socialism can take place in a society. We don't find that kind of principle of dialectical staging of history within the contemporary arguments, as if history has disappeared as a category. And that is to me, very interesting. We don't have an overall strategic understanding of the development dialectically of, in a sense, the series of, in a sense, the relation of the war, whether a war is determined colonial war, imperialist war, nationalist war, and so forth, to the idea of a revolution. I only took the Leninist and the most crude and the most vulgar Leninist understanding of it during 1918 to 24, right? You know, about the development of, in a sense, the war against the West and the Western imperialism.
Yeah, that also reminded me of Karl Korsch's critique of, like, not only of Lenin, Stalin, and also of Marx, because he said that the current Marxist theory of revolution is problematic because it thinks about revolution on the so-called stage theory, because there has to be first bourgeois, and then there could be like socialist
and of course,
he said, like Karl Korsch said, there has to be within every modern revolution. There are at the beginning there are not stages 1 and 2. There are always two possibilities at the beginning. bourgeois and socialist.
Yeah,
Like
exactly.
reactionary or like bourgeois revolutionary and socialist revolutionary. And he criticized like Lenin and Marx is exactly because of that, because they think in the term of stages.
That's the ossification of a certain kind of understanding of the stage development of that belonged to the very early period of the Industrial Revolution through the end of the 19th century, right? That in a sense, that's what Korsch's book, Marxism and Philosophy, was all about, was revising and trying to come up with another theory that would replace that relationship of the fundamental basis of social revolution to a particular understanding of industrialization and modernization. And even Marx and Engels, but before his death, changed their position after the revolutions of 1848, certainly, but even around the period of the Communist Manifesto. So in a sense, there is, as Korsch says, there's this long period, particularly with Lenin, where there's a disorientation. Also similar to what we're feeling now, where there wasn't a grand theory that they felt that they had earlier on. The critique of political economy did not seem to be the fundamental basis for, in a sense, the motive of historical change. Yeah, Peter.
Yeah. I need to confess that I'm siding with Bolivar when it comes to the war in Ukraine. So
I figured you would. I figured you would.
Yeah. I have no hard feelings about what you said.
Yeah.
But my question is actually related to Schmitt's concept of enemy, political enemy, that seemed to me essential in your argument. And well, there are two biblical versions of the same slogan. Who isn't with us is against us. And who isn't against us is with us. And of course, Schmitt, as a good Catholic, picks up the first version, and obviously it had a huge echo in the leftist theory in the second half of the 20th century. And it seemed to me that a lot of controversies that you were referring to were actually related to this kind of stubborn dogmatism that is based on the polemical vision of enemy. And I wonder if you see any possible view of peace, because it was the starting point of your lecture, in the possibility of taking up the second slogan.
Repeat the second slogan again?
Who isn't against us is with us.
The friend of my friend, the enemy of my enemy is my friend?
No, it's...
That's an Arab prophet.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so there are many different variations of this. Okay, so, I mean, the earlier book which I wrote, the Philosophy After Friendship, I deal fundamentally, etymologically, genealogically with the concept of enemy and friend. Going back to the Iranian and the early sources, I see friendship as fundamentally an alliance. That's the root understanding of, in a sense, what friends are. Now, it's evolved into a private bourgeois social category in which we choose and elect our friends. It's an elective relationship versus a kinship structure. But the enemy, in the manner that Schmitt defines it, which is, I think, very, very important, in its modern institutions, in its institutional etymology, is a very practical concept. Schmitt said it's purely a practical concept. In order to function within any kind of political organization, in order to lead an organization, in order to lead the state, in order to divide between, in a sense, territory, between resident, citizen, foreigner, and that sort of thing, you need to be able to absolutely identify the enemy as a practical epistemological category. It's not a philosophical category or a philological category. Whereas friendship has become so overdetermined, in a sense, by religious and other associations, that in a sense we've lost an original sense of, in a sense, the notion of friendship really arises out of an alliance. In other words, in a sense, that second aspect of what you're talking about, the formation of an alliance, and even the basis for military alliance. The basis of friendship is defense, is security, is mutual need, mutual security, mutual society. So I think that that's, Schmitt does not address that.
Yeah, sure.
No, so I completely agree with you. Because he's focusing particularly in his theories during the concept of the political, and particularly in the theory of the partisan. He's focusing on the loss of these certain institutions of both the state, civil society, and politics to be able to understand and identify the enemy in practical terms, and how that has evolved into a polemicized definition that is appropriated by any kind of conflict or struggle to utilize the enemy concept rather than reserving it for a political institution. It should be reserved only for political institutions, and for those institutions juridically, well, as a jurist, legally, you know, is the notion of the enemy concept. So, so I think that, yeah, this would take a lot more, but I just refer you to the 2 chapters of my, the book, the first volume, that this is going to be the second volume, Philosophy After Friendship, which take up the concept of enemy, philos, and then the concept of friend, philos, and the concept of enemy, I take it from the German der Feind, which is, in a sense, shows the evolution of that concept in philosophy.
Okay, thank you. Unless there are some other questions, I would like to thank you for your wonderful lecture.
Thank you, and thank you for
being with us.
responses.
So once again, thank you very much.